So good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this Glenfarclas tasting. Thrilled to have Deborah Stewart, who's one of the sales team members. But I think we stumbled on this last time. Is there an exact title, or are you just a woman who wears many hats and has many responsibilities?
Well, I guess it depends on the day. There is a title on my job, a job title on my business card, which is International Sales Executive, but it
We
does
should
take
add
in
of
anything
mystery to
from.
that.
Oh, I like that. Yes, I'm going to get that added.
Yeah.
But yeah, some like when I was out in market with you guys a couple of weeks ago, it was definitely more good old fashioned brand ambassador. But then some days it's much more like social media manager. The next day it's really tour guide. Sometimes it's John Grant's PA. If you need something done, you just do it. So yes,
Yeah.
it is a very varied job from a day-to-day basis, but that's what makes it fun.
There you go. Well, keeps it interesting. And I mean, you're a small team there, which
Yeah,
probably only adds to the pressure and or excitement about stuff like that. So
for
yeah, I've
sure. I
got a
mean,
good.
currently Ian's in Taiwan. He's out there eating all sorts of weird and wonderful things, if today's group chat was any indication. Um, Kirsten's just back from Italy. I'm just back from Germany. We get around a little bit, but yeah, as I say, that's definitely what makes it more fun.
Absolutely. Well, we're thrilled for you to join us, and I know it's late at night there for you in Scotland. So thank you very much for that. I also want to give a quick shout out to our friends at Pacific Wine and Spirit, who are the importers for Glenfarclas, and without whose support this tasting would have been considerably more expensive. So big thank you to them. They're always a good supporter, and this is such a fun event because it's an opportunity for people to try a whiskey that, for many people might seem outside of the realm of possibility. But it's a gorgeous whiskey. We had it at the in-store tasting a couple of weeks back, and I think you're all going to love it. Really quickly, and just a very quick teaser for those of you who didn't already know or didn't see it, we did put a bunch of new tastings on our website today, including another Glenfarclas tasting, which I'll just quickly share with you if you will bear with me. It's a family cast tasting that is coming up in January. Deb's going to be joining us again on the 12th of January to do 6 summer 2022 releases and then 1 winter 18 release. And Deb, if you need samples of these, let me know, because we should get that sorted, because I've got a set for you if you want them. So that is
Um,
something we should probably do.
if it's actually on your website, I'll go online and I'll see what we've got. We should have most of them at the distillery, I guess.
Okay.
But I'll have a look and see
Yeah. But if
next week.
But if you don't, we can hook you up. And my staff has already got this tasting poured. It's actually already ready to go.
You
They're
can
they're
tell you're not doing
fast.
Advent calendars anymore.
Well, no, and that became a whole thing, which maybe we'll fill people in on later in the year. But we were told to stop at a certain point. So there might have been a disagreement over what we should and shouldn't have been doing. But we'll talk about that in the new year. There's some other stuff on there too. There's a Holyrood tasting, a Macbeth tasting in store, and there will be a virtual one of this eventually. Our Burns Festival, which we do every year. Lots of tastings. I don't want to waste your time on that tonight, because that's not why you're all here, but you can check them out on our site. So Deb, we've got 7 whiskeys to go through. I think most people on this tasting, because I know them all personally, probably know a little something about Glenfarclas, but should we give the 5-minute crash course on what they must know about Glenfarclas? What do you
Sure.
think?
I think we should taste the first whiskey while we do it, right?
That seems fair. Yeah.
So the first whiskey being the 15-year-old, which for many is very much the classic of the range. So it's slightly an outlier in the core range, sitting at 46%, just because that was the way they wanted it done. So going back to the kind of crash course in the history, of course, Glenfarclas is family owned and has been for the last 158 years. The current owner is a gentleman called John Grant. His father was called George Grant, and he was the one who suggested this 15-year-old should be bottled at 46% and not at 43%, because He said this was his favorite age, but he liked it at that strength. And when you work for a family, you say, sure, that sounds like a great plan. We'll absolutely do that. And so the 15 has always been, well, certainly for a lot of years, has been bottled at 46%. To go back a little bit in that family history, the first Grant family to own the distillery was also called John Grant, because they all have the same name. We went John, George, John to the current 5th generation. We're talking here 1865. John Grant decided to buy what was known as Rechlierich Farm, which was a large, renowned cattle farm. And from there, they went from being well-known farmers with a small distillery to well-known distillers with a small farm to distillers. So there is no farm anymore and hasn't been for the last about 30 years. We could talk a little bit as we go as well about some of the production points that make it a little bit different as well. It's nice to see the chat as well. It's already lively. This is what we like. So please do ask questions in the chat, because that is definitely what makes this good fun as well. You're muted now, Andrew. You're muted, Andrew.
I did that on purpose because I was eating a butter tart and I didn't want to interrupt you or have people listen to that. But
just make me jealous, because I don't get butter tarts in Scotland.
I was looking for that photo of Reichlocken Farm, or the painting, which is kind of cool to show people, because I love that. But it's a picture of a farm that's clearly got a smokestack and barrels hanging about. It looks rather distillery-like, and
it's 1791, which is 45 years before there was a legal license.
So an interesting little fact. But I wanted to comment on Jeff's point. Does the distillery have an official position on why they chose not to keep in sequence with 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40? I mean, I guess there'd have to be a 45 too, but
I mean, who knows what will have come in the future. I mean, this predates my time, but my guess is it's more to do with the legal age for drinking in the US. So there is also, of course, a 17, which is mostly unavailable now because of stock restraints. So 15 stock constraints meant that the 15 was a bigger priority, so the 17 mostly disappeared. So there was a 15, a 17, a 21. There was also an 18, but it was a travel retail exclusive. And it's been out, well, basically since the start of COVID. We're like, no, this is not a good use of our stock, given that there is no travel retail market currently. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, the whole travel retail market, that's a big question in the first place because of margins and whatnot. But back to the 15-year, I've always wondered, because like the comment about the 17, the 15 always seemed to be more heavily sherried than the 17. Yeah. The 17 always seemed to be quite a bit lighter. And in our market, I think at times the 17 struggled because it wasn't what people who wanted Glenfarclas wanted. It was something a little different.
I think that's very true. But however, the 17 does also have its fans, people who don't love that slightly heavier sherried style. I can tell you, we do still produce a small amount of 17 for the US, because we don't produce any 15 for the US. And some of my European markets, I was like, why do they get it and we don't? And you're like, no, it's not how it works. You get what you're allowed, and you can like it.
I was going to also add to that is like, well, they get the 15, so why would you care if, I mean, the 17 is good, but I've always liked the 15 better anyway.
The general consensus amongst whiskey drinkers, with any of them up to these kind of ages, especially the younger ones, your 10, your 12, even your 105, they all have like their recipes. So they're not single casks, obviously, none of these are. But our it's not blending, because obviously it's a single malt, but our vatting or our marrying exercise is a lot more straightforward than most people, because we don't use lots of different cask types. So we don't have American oak bourbon casks and sherry casks, and we have sherry casks and that's about it. But we do have a different marriage between first, second, third, and fourth fill. Because we will use these casks up to 4 times. And yes, a fourth fill cask is quite different to a first fill cask, of course, in its style. A lot of the time, a fourth fill cask, when you taste it, can taste almost a bit like a bourbon cask, like a second fill bourbon cask, maybe, simply because by that point you're just getting good oak. You're not really getting sherry influence at all. And so the mix between them is different, and the 15 is slightly heavier sherry than some of the other ones.
Yeah, well, it's a style that I quite like. Your comment though does bring up one question I have, which relates to that term fourth fill, because with Glenfarclas we typically see first fill, refill, or fourth fill, and my understanding with those fourth fills is that they're not always fourth fills. That sometimes it's a second or third, and you're just not sure, so you're calling it a fourth fill because you don't want to oversell it.
Exactly that. So on the family casks, you get that. So a first fill will be called sherry, second fill will be called refill sherry, third fill gets called refill but no sherry, and a fourth fill. Before, kind of maybe 10 years ago, they called them plain. Now they call them fourth fill. But yes, occasionally, if we don't know the full history of a cask, we'll refer to it as a fourth fill. Because sometimes you'll look at it and you go, oh, there's no way that can be a fourth fill. It's too dark. Because generally speaking, the fourth fill will be the palest of the 4. So if we're not 100% sure, we'll call it fourth fill. If it was second fill, we would know, because to put it completely simply, we paint the cask ends between the first and second fill. So if it's been painted, it's at least a second fill or going into a third fill, but it could be a third fill going into a fourth fill if we haven't tracked the cask. And to be fair, if that's the case, it's because it's quite old, because it's quite an old cask. Anything newer, obviously, we're a lot better now than we were 50 years ago at keeping track and keeping records of the casks.
For sure.
People care a lot more now, to be honest.
They do. There's especially in some Northern European markets, they like details, lots and lots of details.
Forward to Limburg Whiskey Festival this year.
What's that?
Limburg Whiskey Festival being the absolute prime example of that.
Yeah, I've been once. It was fun. I do recommend the Limburg Whiskey Fair. I probably won't go back though.
Yeah, once is enough.
It's crazy. You got 2,000 people in this tiny village, maybe 3,000, and the festival's scattered throughout like this town hall and a bunch of tents and things they set up. And the one day I was there, it was 30 degrees. The air conditioning was failing.
It doesn't work anyway.
Yeah, and you're surrounded by like 3,000 sweaty Germans. I mean, it was a bit much for me, but there was some incredible whiskeys to try.
Yeah, all of that is absolutely fair.
Alan had a question, which probably is a good segue into the next whiskey.
Yep, absolutely.
We're doing the 21, and he's asking, isn't it not in production right now?
It is not in production right now. You are correct. But Andrew luckily still had a little bit. And the one place in the world that we still have a little bit of stock is our own visitor centre. So I managed to get my little sample too. Basically, about 2 years ago, I guess it was, we had to have a serious look at the stocks. And the decision was made that we had to remove a few things. And so the 17, as I say, and the 21 were the 2 which were removed to prioritise the 15 and the 25, because both of these are seen almost, like Andrew was saying, the 15 is a key style in the range, so that was seen as a priority over the 17. And 21 and 25, it was a toss-up. You ask 100 people which one they prefer. In fact, we could do it after we've done the 25. We can ask you all which ones you prefer, because it will be a split decision. There's no question. Some people love one, some people love the other. The 21 and 17 will both come back. They are more on hiatus. They haven't disappeared completely. Best guess is the 21 should come back into rotation in 2026 is what we think.
Well, until then, there's still going to be other Glenfarclas bottlings to have, right? So we'll make do. We'll make do. So to me, one of the notes I always love with the Glenfarclas 21, to me, it always reminds me of like a warm blueberry pie out of the oven. You get this nice
Nice.
buttery pie crust and some nice fruit. There's sugar in there.
That's your butter
Um,
tarts.
yeah, but this is blueberry. This is
Blueberry. Okay,
blueberry
yours.
pie, homemade pie crust. You know, the works.
It is. It's again. I think the 15's heavier first full sherry, in its style. This reminds me more of the kind of like a good mix of second and third fill, which is what's going to give it just a little bit more of the almost more balanced. Whereas the ones that are more first fill style tend to become quite powerfully sherried. And then of course it becomes personal taste.
One of the things that I love about distilleries like Glenfarclas, your medium-sized and smaller distilleries, is even with whiskeys like this, there's always a little bit of batch variance. And
Yeah.
there has to be because of the size of batches you're doing. And doesn't matter how big or good your distillery is, you're always going to have a degree of batch variance. But the 21, though, to me, somehow still seems to be one of the most consistent stylistically. Just interesting to me.
It is true, and it's also why, with the exception of the 50, every bottle that we're tasting tonight comes in a dark glass bottle, because the batch variation will also apply to the colour of the whiskey. So a choice was given to John Grant a few years ago when they were redesigning the pack and so on, which of course doesn't happen very often. You know, you might have not noticed that we're not the ones who rebrand and change everything about our branding every 3 months or so. But it's been a good few years that it's looked more or less as it does now. And the choice was made to either accept that there's going to be colour difference, which you really don't necessarily want to show people, because people do still have the perception that the lighter one isn't as good. So if it's lighter this year than it was last year, they don't want it. So the two choices are: you add colouring or you change the colour of the glass. And so it was a clear choice that we're not going to be adding colouring to our whiskey. So therefore, you need to change the colour of the glass so that it's not clear at a glance.
You know, I don't think for me, I had even noticed that the Glenfarclas, like it had never occurred to me that the bottles were tinted until, you know, the family cast came out, and all of a sudden here are these Glenfarclas in all these different shades. And wow, like you can tell how dark some of them are and how pale some of them are, because you know, I think even as a consumer or as a retailer, sometimes those little subtle things aren't obvious until they're staring you in the face and they're obvious. And the example I use on that is I used to have customers who would come in and they'd tell me they wanted the most heavily peated whiskey in the shop. And this is going back about 12 years. And at that time, for me, it was Kilchoman. Kilchoman was the most heavily peated whiskey in the shop. It was 3 years of age and like proper heavily peated. And the customers would take one look at it without trying to see, what are you talking about? It's not peaty enough. I'm like, what are you talking about? And eventually one or two of them were pointing at the bottle and say, well, look at the bottle. It's not dark enough. And if you look at all the Islay whiskeys, they're all in dark tinted glass. And I think consumers were subconsciously assuming that if an Islay whiskey was in dark glass, then it was peaty. But
peat
if it
is
wasn't,
black,
it wasn't.
so it must be peaty.
Yeah, but it's invisible. You can't see it. So
absolutely,
I'm still loving this 21. It's still one of my favorites in the range. It's elegant. It's easy drinking. It's sad that it won't be available for a couple of years, but our
absence
stash
makes
of
the
it
heart grow fonder.
It does. And we've got a deal on the minis, 21-year-old minis starting next week. So you'll be able to buy the minis at a crazy good price. So keep an eye out for that. Same with the 25, which is the next one we're on to, when we're ready to go on to it, though.
Yeah. Talking about peat, this is actually, we're doing a good tasting here, because we will get old enough to get into the peated Glenfarclas timing. Early 1970s was when they stopped doing the barley themselves on site. So up until that time, they were using a little bit of the peat from Benrinnes, which is the hill behind the distillery, which you see on the outline, the drawing on the label. And the peat from there, I mean, there is variation in peat depending on which part of Scotland you're from, but it wasn't so much the type of peat that varied, it was the fact that we didn't use very much. We did just use a little bit, but there was a little bit used until that time. And then, like so much of the industry at that time, the decision was taken to move to using the commercial malting companies that were coming up round about us. And the argument is quite simply they can do a better job, a more consistent job, more consistent quality than we can, and they can do it at a better price than we can. So it doesn't actually make a lot of sense to do it yourself when you can get a better job done by someone else. But the peat, obviously, we're not coastal. You know, we're quite far inland. We're quite far up the Spey. So as a result, you won't get that kind of beautiful. Look at that. Like I prepared that earlier.
I stole this from the Spirit of Speyside West festival site. So
nice.
Yeah, this is not my photo, but it shows you Ben Rinnes rising behind the distillery and
the barley,
surrounded by
one
barley
field
fields.
That's left as well. Yeah. Looking at that, I would say that was probably taken in about August, if the barley's anything to go by. Yeah, so that's Ben Rinnes. The people who don't live in Canada or Switzerland call that the Whiskey Mountain, but it's very much a hill. But it does give water to 6 distilleries, if I'm not mistaken. Because the distilleries are all that's a hill. There we go. Yeah. It is, as I'm saying, it's a hill. It's what is it, about 1,000 feet, I believe. And given that I'm sitting about, let me think, what are we here? 60, 70 feet where I'm sitting in my house in Elgin. So yeah, there's a slight height difference. I said to the production manager, Callum, I said to him earlier, oh yeah, you know, if you're going to be having a few drinks tonight, feel free to come online at midnight. And he was like, no, I'm being sensible tonight. Well, that's disappointing. And he said, are you going to stay at work to do the tasting? I was like, I'm not sitting in the office until midnight in the freezing cold up at the distillery. The guys would be in production, so I could have gone through into the still house to stay warm, I guess. But that seemed a little bit excessive. Like, no, I think I'll just stay at home. That way I can wear my Christmas jumper.
Nice. I love it.
It's that time of year.
I've got the subtle Christmas decorations behind me, so I'm all over that. Let's move on to the 25.
Yeah.
Which the 25 and the 15 always seem to be sort of more similar to me in the sense of the weight of the sherry. Obviously, different drams with more age behind them. But the 25 was kind of, I think that was a customer favorite for a long time. Back in the day when you could have it for,
Don't say it. Don't say it.
$150 or something like that. In the olden times.
Those were the days. My dad had said, when Granny was a boy.
Well, there was a time as well, though, Deb, when you could get the Glenfarclas 40 for $400. I think that's the price when it first launched. And people were like, oh, that's expensive. And I'm like, are you crazy? It's even 12 years ago, that was a great price for a 40-year-old whiskey.
Absolutely. How times have changed. I think the other one that's funny with that, of course, is the family casks. You know, when we first launched the family casks, they launched in 2007. And at that time, you could get from 52 to 94. That was the range of casks you could buy. And the cost for all of them at that time was about £15,000. Now, I'm sure many of you who are in the tasting here tonight have at least one. In fact, I can see that Peter has even got some behind him, some family casks. The little book that comes in it, the little red book, I did the most recent update of that because obviously that's another part of my job. And so I went to the visitor centre and I counted up what it would cost to buy one of everything now. So admittedly, the 52, 53 have gone. We don't sell them anymore, but you can still get 54 up to now 2008, which is the latest release, which just came out here about 2 months ago. And if you want one of everything now, it's £155,000.
Yeah, it's different times, that's for sure.
Absolutely. But I
Well,
think where we're lucky really is with the 25-year-old, because we still have a reasonable quantity of 25-year-old that we can still, sell. And the I think one of the things we're guilty of at Glenfarclas, and tonight's tasting is absolutely evidence of that, is we're too casual about age. We talk about 25 like it's no big deal. But in reality, we're talking about something from the 90s, not even from this century.
Oh, give me a quick second here, Deb. I've switched off my earbuds and I've lost my audio. So, come on. Oh, there we go. I think it's back on. We're back. We're back in business. Can you hear me?
I certainly can.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, no, I was getting a weird echo coming through my earbuds, so I decided to kick them out because that was probably the problem. Well, I'm loving the 25. It's not quite as soft and creamy as the 21,
No,
but going into more like kind of tart and sweet fruits on the nose.
a little bit heavier, that a little bit more depth as well coming in.
Going more towards like a classic Christmas cake
And
note.
is that right time of year?
It is that time of year. I don't know if you hold Christmas cakes in high or low regard, Deb. But again, my mom, in addition to making great mincemeat pies, also makes a really good Christmas cake.
With what booze?
Usually rum or brandy, one of the two goes into that. So it depends.
And just to go fully northeast Scotland here, we have a variety and it's called a clootie dumpling.
Oh, I've had that before. Isn't that where you
Mm.
boil it? You boil it in
A piece of cloth, a clute.
yeah, yeah. It's an interesting dessert. I've used that in a tasting note before because it's a drier
Yeah,
style of Christmas cake.
because it's boiled rather than baked, so it does come out a slightly different texture. I
Mm.
say that like I know. I am no one's idea of a baker. Like seriously, you do not want me to go anywhere near an oven. It's just no.
I'd be interested to know what the origin of that is. Is that like basically someone in a bothy taking their shirt and boiling a mix
The,
of stuff together in a pot on a fire just to make some dessert?
I would genuinely assume that they didn't have oven, but they did have like a
Pots.
fire, so like a hob and a stove, a stove top rather than an actual
Mhm.
oven. So yeah, absolutely.
All hot and bothy. I like it. On the palate, there's some nice toasted oak notes, chocolate, the sherry, like soft sherry tones in there. Should we talk a little bit? Like I know in a lot of your tastings you'll talk about the sherry suppliers that you deal with because these
Yeah.
are long-standing relationships and plays a role. Like one of the things I love about Glenfarclas is most of the range, especially the core range, it is noticeably sherried, but it's not over the top sherried. And I think a part of that comes from the type of casks you're sourcing. Do you want to talk about your sherry partnership?
Yeah. So especially this, so with the 25-year-old, anything first fill sherry in this will be from the kind of early days of the relationship with the current supplier. So we've had the same supplier since, well, yeah, between 25 and 30 years. The name of that supplier is Jose Miguel Martin. And so Miguel is a bodega just outside of Jerez. I say that like I've been there. I've never been allowed to visit. That seems like far too much like fun. My colleague Ian was there at the end of June, start of July, because a group from Japan wanted to go. So he said, yeah, let's go. That'll be fun. And then he said, Deborah and Kirsten should get to come too, because that'd be really educational. And John said, don't be so bloody stupid. You're not going to Jerez in start of July if you don't have to. It's going to be like 40 degrees. And I'm like, okay, that's fair. I'll go a time, but it's maybe not quite so ridiculously hot.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so Miguel, basically we have an agreement with Miguel. So what it means is he will always give us the casks we want. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite cover pricing. So apparently a fresh sherry butt next year goes up to 1,900 euros per cask. So that's not everyone's best piece of news, but hey, it has to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And we buy from them a mixture of hogsheads and butts. So that's the two sizes that we're going to use. The butts 500 litres, the hogsheads are 250, and we'll get a couple of thousand new casks every year from Miguel. And they basically just drive them over from Spain now. So I know that some bourbon casks get shipped to Scotland in stages and get rebuilt, but it's not worth, the work would be more than the transportation costs coming from Spain. So we just get these big trucks coming in from Jerez, and at one point I was asked to try and explain to the driver where to go. I was like, I speak French and German, I don't speak Spanish. Sorry, there's not enough what I can do. As we were trying to explain to the driver, he was going the wrong way. But I loved watching them take the delivery. All they simply do is they put a really big sponge at the bottom of the on the ground next to the truck, and they roll them off it. Yeah. It works.
If they're well made, they'll survive. If they're not,
absolutely.
They won't.
They better be well made at 1,900 euros a cask.
Exactly. Well, and I'm kind of curious about this because they're coming in from Spain in a truck. Is it refrigerated? No.
No, just not bog standard. Well, actually, no, because the trucks in North America look quite different to the trucks in Europe. But yeah, 2 parts, so it's like a double truck. Usually one of hogsheads, one of butts each time. And when it comes to then in between uses, we'll assess each cask, decide whether it needs repair. Very basic repairs can get done by our warehouse team. Anything more than that gets sent to a local cooperage for repair, but with very big stickers on them which say "Return to Glenfarclas." Yeah, these are not yours.
Yeah. Well, not everyone's sherry casks are the same, and it's something that I'd like to highlight because it makes a difference in the spirit at the end of the day.
And for sure, I mean, the sherry casks have changed a bit over the years. There's very few casks in Scotland nowadays which are what we would have called sherry casks 100 years ago. Obviously the reason they used so much sherry is because that was historically what they did. The English love for sherry, meaning that we would get these casks lying around with nothing else to do with them. So what you do, you put the spirit you're trying to hide from the tax man in there. And then you go, oh, this actually tastes nicer. Maybe we should do more of this. How many would you fit in a truck? Depends on the size. So a butt is 500 litres. That's the capacity. A hogshead is 250. You'll get a couple of hundred at a time, depending on the size. But basically, they have almost like shelves inside it. So you have 3 layers. Yeah, I got that, Jeff, but I thought I'd answer the question anyway. And so you'll have multiple levels inside each truck. So 3 or 4 levels high. So yeah, you can manage a couple of hundred at a time.
Yeah, well, that's efficient. It's a lot more efficient than I don't know if you've heard the guy at Daft Mill, how he collects his casks from Speyside Cooperage, the one down in the lowlands. He collects them in his horse trailer, roughly 20 at a time, which is just classic Francis, efficient farmer mentality. But Phil's question reminded me of one time George was in the store for a tasting, and I kept saying barrel, and he kept correcting me with casks because, in Scotland, barrel, I'm sure in some parts of the world, barrel just means any oak barrel of
generic. It's a generic, yeah.
But in Scotland, they actually have meaning. Like a barrel is 190 to 200 liters, and it's ex-bourbon. And then hogsheads are 250. But yeah, it was fun. I've never forgotten that, and I always correct myself now because I felt like such an idiot. I couldn't help saying barrel. But
it's what comes naturally, but yeah, no, it does have a very specific meaning, and I think the reason probably why we pick up on it more is because we don't use them. So if you were to get into all of Scotland's warehouses, you'd find about 90% of what's in there is bourbon barrels. But we just have to be different and awkward and not use those. So I actually, interestingly enough, I was actually at Glenfiddich on Tuesday, because I was there for a meeting, and they said, would you like to do a tour afterwards? And I said, sure, that sounds like fun. because I used to work there 17 years ago. So go on, let's see how different it is. And they were talking about some of their capacities and so on. And it is just crazy how much, you know, they're absolutely huge now. I mean, they were big, obviously, even back then. But in terms of their capacity in the warehouses, because our warehouses, we do all right. You know, there's 100,000 casks in the warehouses, most of which belong to us. So most of which is Glenfarclas single malt. But they have some warehouses which will take almost half that in one warehouse, and the smell in those warehouses is still not as good as the smell in warehouse number 1 at Glenfarclas, because they are metal sheds basically. They're not dunnage warehouses. They don't have the natural earth floors. They don't have the airflow, the humidity, the big stone walls to keep all the good stuff in. So yeah, it's still interesting, and it's an interesting site. You know, there's so much there to kind of see. But people ask you, you're saying, you know, small to medium distilleries like Glenfarclas. Well, if we're at an average week, just under an average week for production, our week is their day, is what I discovered, to where they are now in terms of production.
It's crazy. I mean, I like to measure new distilleries in terms of how long it would take them to produce what Glenfiddich does. And, you know, you can change the criteria around. But I remember, and this was going back about 15 years, being at William Grant's at Glenfiddich, Balvenie, and they had mentioned how many casks they had on site. And I just thought it was funny to think about it and to figure out how long it would take Edredauer to produce the volume of whiskey. And this is back when Edredauer was only making 100,000 liters a year.
And they were the smallest time,
and it was something like 2,000 years of production was what it would take for them to produce what William Grant's had maturing in Dufton. And for me, that was like a mind-blowing number.
It is. It's absolutely crazy. And I mean, if you think about Scotland wide, the total, I mean, I haven't heard a recent figure, so this figure's a few years old, but at one point, a couple of years ago, there were about 30 million casks. I want to say there's about 30, I think it was 30 million casks of whiskey in Scotland. There's about 5 million people. So yeah, just enough for 6 each.
It was pretty good odds. So
are there more casks or sheep though? That's always the question.
I'm gonna go with probably these days, it's probably more casks.
Yeah.
10 years ago, I would have said maybe sheep. Oh, that's not the right one. We want to move on to the 25 or the 30-year-old. Yep. Let's find the 30-year-old here. All right, so 30-year. Put her up on the screen. This is when you start moving into the red doors.
Absolutely. So the warehouse doors at the distillery are red, so it's not just something we made up. They genuinely do look like the packaging for 30, 35, and 40. The story goes that way back in 1954, John's father was asked by some of the team what colour of paint they should buy because they needed to repaint the warehouse doors, and he gave the eternally Scottish answer of whichever one is cheapest. And for whatever reason at that time, red was cheaper than anything else, and so they painted the warehouse doors were red. And I was told when I first started that they were then red, had been red ever since. However, that's not true, because I found a picture in our beautiful like coffee table book, which is the staff photo from 1979. And in that picture, the door is blue. So I said, John, what's that about? And he said to me, well, in the late 70s, the manager here was a guy called, I never remember his name, so we'll say Andrew Ferguson. And Andrew was ex-DCL, Distillers Company Limited, which is now Diageo. And when he left to date, current day Diageo, there we go, warehouse number 6, sorry, the smallest warehouse out there. He happened to have their corporate paint, and so their corporate paint was blue. And so briefly the warehouse doors were blue, but when they went back to having to pay for their own, they went back to being red. Now, the picture that Andrew just showed there, that particular warehouse is, we're 99.9% certain, the smallest official duty-free warehouse in Scotland. It is officially a warehouse. There are 3 casks in there. Now, we were never going to have the biggest because it's not our style. We only use dunnage warehouses. That means you're always limited. They can never be more than 3 high, so you're never going to have the biggest there. So we said, yeah, let's have the smallest instead. It takes a lot of paperwork to register a duty-free warehouse, but they did it just for a laugh. Absolutely. And funnily enough, I actually had a good friend of mine who was taking part in a tasting over in Geneva about 2 weeks ago, just texting me going, is there really anything inside that warehouse? I'm like, yeah, of course there is. I think it was just for show. Well, we're having a debate in the tasting. So I sent you your pictures because they painted those warehouse doors this summer. So I actually took a picture of the inside of that. Yeah, I have more, my clothes would not all fit in that warehouse. That is for sure. It is that small, but it's fun. Callum, the production manager, that's just underneath his office. So he calls it his private supply.
Mm-hmm. Isn't it like under a staircase or something? Which
Exactly right. So the steps go up either side to go into the production offices, and it's just basically it's the cupboard under the stairs.
Very, very good use of the space. I fully support and endorse that. 30-year-old's pretty elegant, soft. I know we're not delving too much into tasting notes and whatnot, but yeah, it's always a pretty dram. This
really
is one
very drinkable.
It is very, very drinkable. Far too drinkable for a red box whiskey because that could get expensive very quickly.
True.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, for a 30, it's always very reasonable.
Well, and I think that, I mean, to be fair, and Deborah, I think that this, if anything, at times might have been a problem, is that relatively speaking, Glenfarclas has often been too good a value. And then the problem is you run out. You just can't meet demand. And it's a tricky thing to do. And I think, I respect family businesses that are, I mean, even with your family cast now, you could charge a lot more for some of them than you are. But there's this old school mentality to how things get priced. And yes, things that are
don't give
rare,
them ideas.
but the price increases are usually logical and understandable, except if we're talking about family cast vintages like 1984, which have been out forever. And people are like, why is 1984 10 grand? It's because there's none left.
And we've actually, I'll be completely, open and honest here. We've had a similar thing happening with the late 70s recently. So they have jumped because they're no longer as readily available. So basically, the idea with the family casks is that the youngest ones will always stay kind of where they are pricing wise, maybe go up a little bit. I'll tell you, this is again completely honestly, what was last year's youngest price becomes this year's youngest price. So it goes up a year every year. So we're adding each year the next vintage. In fact, we just discussed today the fact that the tasting to choose the 2009 will be on the 6th of May. So we need to tell the gentleman who was at the tasting in the shop, Andrew, who I promised he could come to that because he's going to be in Scotland that day.
I don't remember who that is, but I'll put some thought into it.
I think he sent me an email. It's fine.
Spirit of Space Head. Was that Doug?
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Spirit of Space Head Whiskey Festival is from the 1st to the 6th of May next year. And that's actually the meeting I was at Glenfarclas was for their AGM. And they said, and we want all details of all events by the 17th of January. And we went, oh, crap. Right. Well, we better think about what we're going to do then. Not least because I'm off to France next week and then Kirsten's going to be away. Ian's away. So there's like 2 more days this year that we're actually all in the office. So he's like, yeah, we can't wait any longer. We need to, because they need proper descriptions and everything by the 17th of January. So that's going to happen then. So yeah, every year as part of Spirit Space Head, we choose the first of the next family cast release. So the first 2009, and then it'll get bottled late summer for release. I mean, this is always the problem, that you guys have being so far away from us here. The European markets have the 23 release already, but it just takes so much longer to get there for you. You're always almost like 6 or 8 months behind almost.
Yeah, well, it depends on things like consolidation and that, the importer's got to make it worthwhile from the standpoint of shipping.
They do a great job, so
they're they're a great company to work with, and if we have to wait a little longer, it's just fine. On that note, there are some summer 2022 bottlings that we were out of that are coming back in stock. We've been able to get a few more bottles of certain things, including the 1979, which you were talking about the 70s being harder and harder to come by. I'm a 78, so I actually was lucky. I think I even got a 78 on this last order because I was like, these are going to start getting really expensive really quickly. So I'm glad I grabbed another bottling of 78. And I might have to grab one of those 79s for my brother because that's his birth year. Though he's very frugal and it might be
How
wasted on him.
much?
So maybe I'll buy it for myself and drink it in his honor and think of him when I drink it. That's probably the best. And maybe once I'll let him have a dram from it. But
I always did like your style, Andrew.
he's a quantity over quality guy, and I'm the opposite. So, very, very different people.
The reason why some of these years are becoming hard to come by as well is, I mentioned before that we're getting hogsheads and butts every year. There was a while back then when it was more one over the other, and late 70s, early 80s were very much more hogsheads. And hogsheads tend to not hold their strength as well because they're smaller. So they give a more concentrated flavor quicker. So you get a really nice, rich, powerful, influenced whiskey faster, but the strength doesn't hold up as well. So there's nothing sadder than going to an old cask of whiskey and discovering it's 39% ABV.
That's heartbreaking. I just some back and forth in the chat. I've really loved those 1978 and 79 bottlings they're all called fourth fill. They're all from hogsheads, but I think they're all hogsheads. I don't know if they're hogsheads or butts, but
yeah, they are.
About them is they're getting very tropical because it's the spirits being able to shine, the sherry's not overpowering them. And it's a style of whiskey that I really love, especially at an older age.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think there's a 79, sorry, Andrew, which is definitely my favorite of all of them I've ever had. Although that was a cask sample rather than an actual bottled one. But yeah.
Next time I'm over, we'll have to pay a visit to that cask if possible.
Sure, we can organize that.
Should we move on to the 35?
Yes, the 35 is the newbie in the range. This is the second year we produced it only. So basically 30, 35 and 40 are what we're calling limited release. They're currently being released every year. That will not be the case forever. So the 40 may not be around forever, is what I'm currently being told in terms of stock, because of some of the strength of some of those casks as well. It doesn't mean it won't then come back. Of course, it probably will, but it might have a couple of years where we just stick to 30 and 35. Then other years we might do 30 and 40. Other times it might be 35 and 40. So we'll always like to have at least 2 of the 3 of these. But we might not always have all 3 of them. It does depend on having the right casks at the right age at the right time. Oh, I forgot that we tried this when you were visiting. I'm just seeing your own tasting notes there.
Oh yeah, no. Well, and I think I might have even. Oh no, those were written on the fly at the distillery, as it said.
Yeah.
I actually had to interpret some of the scribblings I made on my phone.
That's right.
Yeah, because I did the little Samsung pen. But yeah, this is a very pretty whiskey. It's interesting. It does slot neatly in between the 30 and 40 profile wise, which I guess is exactly what you'd expect. It's a little older than the 30, a little younger than the 40. But yeah, it's a nice little addition to it. I mean, I think it's just hilarious. Glenfarclas as a distillery has got this bizarre core range by the standards of any other distillery, because most others top out at 30. And if it's more
they're
than
very
30,
lucky.
it's an ultra luxury bottling if it's above 30. And you've now got 30, 35, and 40. And even knowing they're limited and they won't be available every year, I mean, it's just incredible that you
It's an
have.
incredible privilege that we have, and it does go back quite a lot to John's father. He was the one who, in, shall we call them, the lean years, because obviously historically whiskey's always been a cyclical thing. So there are good years for a few years, and then it gets harder. And we'll be honest, volume wise, this year is definitely going to be a harder one. For us as a small independent distillery, we're not actually even remotely bothered by that. It's quite good. It helps us build our stocks, but um, the we've never stopped production. We've never let this. We've never said, well, we're not selling as much this year, so we'll make less. We've just said, okay, maybe we're selling less to other people, so we will keep it for ourselves, drink it another time, and that's what's led to us having the stocks that we do. But as we've said, there are for sure now quite a number of years where we are out of casks. So we are sitting on a couple from 53, which is our oldest cask still available. One from 54, a couple of others from the 50s, a few from the 60s, but yeah, it's no longer pages of stock inventory from those. It's a page for all the really old stuff. But we still have any, which is pretty lucky.
You know, it's interesting to hear this because I mean, even, and you worked for William Grant and Sons, which even though it's a giant company, is still ultimately a family-run business at the end of the day. And then the other classic example in Scotch whiskey is a company like Gordon MacPhail. And it's interesting how like the medium-sized family-run or even large family-run companies have a very different mentality about time and markets and cycles. And, you know, obviously a lot of Gordon MacPhail's success was probably built on buying when no one else had the ability to pull their checkbook out. And, you know, there's times that make more sense to distill more and more to distill less because of what your input costs are.
Yeah.
And in the grand scheme of time, everything's going to kind of wash itself out. But, you know, the big companies, when things get really, you know, tight and scary, they lay people off and they close the distillery down until the sun comes out again.
And then 20 years later, they go, oh, wow, look at this distillery. Why don't we reopen it, change its name and call it something else?
Or not change its name and reopen it and pretend it's the same thing. But
even though it's not the
we
same
don't need to get into
stills.
that debate. That's a heated debate.
But it is, it's definitely true that it takes a lot to say, well, like this year even, you know, it would have made sense to slow down production, especially the first half of the year, because our energy costs were so high. Our energy costs went from an average month in early 2021 were £95,000 a month. They went up to 500,000. So it'd be quite easy to say, oh, £500,000 just for gas. But we didn't slow down at all. I mean, the market accepted that these things have an impact. Luckily for us, those costs have gone a long way back again. They're not what they were, but they're certainly nowhere near as high as they were either. But other things have just kept going up. So it's not an easy one. Now, it's, you know, one of the key things of the distillery, the fact that we still do direct fire stills. Does that mean we were more impacted by that than other people? Possibly. But at the end of the day, it's such a fundamental part of the character of the whiskey we produce that we don't have a choice in that. The way that we direct fire has changed, however. So we have gone from coal to gas in the 80s, but more important, well, not more importantly, but more recently, we've gone from what looked like the volume control on your stereo to turn the fire up and down to a really high-tech computer controlled system. In fact, I was actually in the control room yesterday speaking to Stillman, and he happened to have the screen up for the fire. And what happens is it looks like this. It just goes up in tiny little steps. So the computer now controls how quickly the temperature increases inside the still, which is a big change, but it means we can be really, really precise about what we're actually doing and how we're doing it. But we still have our rummagers. That's the most important thing. But luckily, the rummager is no longer turned by the water wheel. So for those of you that've been to the distillery, our beautiful water wheel, which is just for show now, but used to be used to turn the rummager, it froze this week.
Yeah.
I've never seen that before.
So I think for some people, they might not, many of them might know what a rummager is, but for those who don't, it's like a giant copper chain link cable that gets dragged around the bottom of a still in a circle to keep things from burning onto it if you're direct firing. Most distilleries don't direct fire anymore. Glenfarclas is rather unique in that regards.
That's my favorite word in the whole distillery. I love the word, the rummager. Because it does exactly what it says on the tin. I like to describe it as cooking risotto, can't let it stop. It's got to move all the time. Or tablet for another good Scottish reference.
Absolutely. Well, it's funny that your water wheel froze because until we had snow overnight, they kept reopening our golf courses here because it was so warm and so dry, which is a sure sign we're going to have a drought this coming year. But we were able to get out on my road bike in late November and early December. I mean, that's unheard of. It's crazy.
That's not right. Yeah.
Something's amiss. There is some comments in the chat. It seems some people are more partial to the 30 than the 35.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can choose a favorite between them. They're both good. I like them both. I think maybe we should probably move on to the 40 and see what we think about that. But
just complete the little set, right?
Yeah. And I know Jeff was taking the piss out of Tom for using his old school blender's glasses. Well, I did that for everything from the 30 up. So I'm on the same page with you there, Tom. And I've got a glass dishwasher. It cleans them just fine. So I'm not sure what Jeff is talking about.
I had to steal glasses from work because I don't actually have any Glenfarclas glasses at home. And it did occur to me that using competitors' glasses or a random mixed mash wouldn't be great.
I think that's called borrowing.
Borrowing, for sure.
You're doing it for an official work business, so it's completely above board.
And if I forget to take them back on, Thursday when I'm back in the office, that's not my fault.
You've got boxes of them, surely.
We have bought. I said I took them home yesterday, on Thursday, now because of course it's now Saturday here. And I said to the visitor centre, I'm guessing on a Friday in December you're not going to use your full stock of glasses. Like, nah, you're good. It's fine. There are no 300 glass tastings happening this week, strangely enough.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's talk 40 year. Formerly the oldest whiskey with an age statement on it in the Glenfarclas range on a regular basis. And it's been
to answer Sky's question, which is a very good one, straight in there. As I was saying before, these casks don't even always hold their strength to 40% around this age sometimes if they're hogsheads. So they did have to make the change a few years ago because they discovered they were struggling to keep the bottling at 46%. Because they were naturally getting to around that or just under that strength. So they were having to look for look especially for casks the right strength to make that work. But that was when it changed as well from the packaging. So it's quite easy to tell if it's in a tube, it's the 46. If it's in the red doors, it's 43.
Mm-hmm. That changeover, and I think this is something I've talked with you about at a different tasting, maybe not the last one we did here in Calgary, but I remember being told years and years ago that John's father, when he was running the distillery in the 60s and 70s, there were periods when the supply of casks was really tight and the cost for them went up enormously. And his solution to this was to just fill at a higher strength.
Yeah, 68.5.
Yeah, and that explains why, especially some of the family casks from the late 60s and early 70s have sometimes been at eye-watering ABVs.
Yeah. The other classic example of that was the 40-year-old 105 they did, which was 60% ABV. Oh, go on, don't just show off there, Andrew. That's fine.
I got one. I got one of those. My actually, you met her. My good friend Jane gave me one of these for my 40th birthday. There's there's not much left in it. There's maybe a couple of drams left in it, but yeah, I've got one of those beauties. So
Yeah, the chance of getting 40 years old at 60% ABV, like you can't really explain that, even with a higher filling strength. Every condition had to be perfect for that to happen. It is very much a case of there are, all our warehouses are dunnage, but that doesn't mean the conditions are actually the same in all of them. They're a lot less different than if you have some dunnage and some palletized, for example, but there are still some corners of the warehouse that are darker, damper, all that kind of thing. And so those corners, things tend to hold their strength better. I'm not sure if we talked about this last time, the fact that we actually have cognac in the warehouse, and they specifically asked for the dampest, coldest corner of the warehouse for the cognac to see how that would affect it as well.
you did mention that. Well, there was at one point a gift set that involved a bottle of cognac and a bottle of scotch, which I'm sure for Pacific caused a nightmare from a registration standpoint, just knowing the way that things have to be slotted into one category or another. You can't have something that's both. Just not how it works. But yeah, there was the Hein cognac, and for some, do you know what was the reasoning behind the obelisks? Because weren't those packaged in like obelisks?
Yeah, whose idea that was. I dread to think personally, I'm not a fan. It's going a bit too far, but yeah, some people obviously liked that, but I'm not sure there was any actual meaning behind it other than it had to look different because it was very different. So it had to look completely different to anything that either brand does normally. Of course, the Hein bottle being quite distinctive as well.
Well,
we've actually just put, for those of you that everyone knows Marks and Spencers. I'm sure Marks and Spencers have just launched their Christmas collections of brands, and Hein and Glenfarclas are sitting side by side. So John's quite happy about that.
oh, I'm sure. I was gonna say maybe, and this might be coming from a colony perspective, maybe the reason they put them in obelisks is that you had products from both France and Britain in the broader sense of the word, and those are both countries that took obelisks from Egypt home with them. So maybe that was something to do with it. I don't know if that's too
As I'm
outside.
sitting in Elgin, I'm not sure if all the carry on about the Elgin marbles has been getting discussed and over with you guys or not, but
Good old Lord Elgin.
but
Anyway,
at least you know it's Elgin and not Elgin.
that's right. Yeah, the Elgin Margles, good times. Luke is saying pineapples on the 40 for him. It is definitely going into that sort of like gooey tropical territory, which is really lovely on the nose of that 40-year-old.
But a lot of chocolate as well. You actually drink it. Nose it's a lot fresher in the nose and a lot richer, I find, in the mouth feel.
Like a fruit flan, like a French fruit flan that's had a nice little glaze or something on top of it. Oh,
Think where you were 40 years ago when we were distilling this.
I was actually probably in France.
Oh, nice.
At least that summer. My dad was a lawyer, took a sabbatical. My first memories are of France. Like I
That's cool.
remember standing under the Eiffel Tower. I remember many things about that trip. I remember being introduced to foie gras. I've been a fan ever since. Yeah, no, it's good times. It would probably be impolite of me to ask where you were 40 years ago, but maybe.
I make no secrets of this. I was 2 years old.
Oh, there you go.
So I'm going to guess I was in my mum's house in Lossiemouth. In fact, no, they hadn't moved into that house yet. We've still been in the flat.
So you're an 81 then, am I correct?
I'm an 81, yeah.
Yeah, that's another tough year to find bottlings from.
I do have the 81 port cask next door, so that's probably the nicest open bottle I've got at home right now.
Yeah, it could be worse though. You could be an 84.
Yes, this is true. This is
the
very true.
hardest vintage in history to have and be a whiskey lover. I don't know if anyone else got any other thoughts on the 40, but I mean, the 30 and the 35 are great, but the 40 to me is just a whole other level. It's elegant, soft. There's nice tobacco tones in there. It's tropical. There's even like a little bit of like a treacle sauce too. It's just very, very pretty. To Alan's point about the whether I can raise or fold, I'm gonna fold. I'm gonna let Alan have this one because I know it's in his cellar and I know I will lose. I do have some good things though. There are definitely a lot of good things to be had in here. So anyway, 40 is great. Deb, do you want to talk to us about the 50 now? Is it likely that when this one's gone, will we see other 50-year-olds out over time, or is this like a one-off?
I mean, never say never, right? You know, we do still have casks of that age, but it is a very different. So you mentioned before about, you know, batch variety and so on. There'll never be another 50 quite like this. This is for sure, because the variety of casks available is so small compared to anything else. So we are never going to be able to make one that's going to look, smell, or taste like this. The 50, I have to say that was something that I did a bit of the work on. The idea being it should look like it's something between the 30 and the 40, like the same kind of idea, but nicer. So that was the kind of thought behind it. It's a fun one as well, though, because it was bottled way back very, very early 2020. And the reason for that was we were talking about doing this maybe. We got our hands on the liquid. We tried it. We're like, ooh, this is really good. And then they checked the strength and it was like 50.3. Like, get that down and get it bottled right now so we can have it at 50% ABV. Because again, it's quite special to have a 50-year-old. It's always special, but to have a 50-year-old at 50% ABV is really just a lot of fun. So that is natural cask strength. That is just the strength it was at in its own right at that time. Now, again, it's going back to our privilege of having the casks to be able to do these things. It's not a single cask. There were a couple of different vintages even in it, which probably we've never talked about what vintage it was. If I'm not mistaken, it's 68 and 69, but you know, don't quote me on that. But altogether, we did about 900 bottles. So there was 800, but like the one that Andrew showed on the screen there, and then there was another 100 done in a slightly different format, the good old 750 ml as opposed to 700 ml. So we tell you on the bottle there's 836 of the decanters. It's actually not true. There's a bit less than that. But it was much more fun to say it was one of 836, given that's the year the distillery was licensed, than to say one of 821 or whatever it was. It just no meaning to us. So we can tell you there's more than there is. We can't tell you there's less.
Yeah. Well, and just putting that back up for a quick second. I mean, it's a beautiful bottle, nice packaging. I mean, our photo there, to be honest, doesn't even really truly do it justice. The bottle is very pretty, and not that really matters.
But it does at this level. It does.
At this level, it does. The box it's stayed true somewhat to the other ones. You know, part of me wonders if this still should have been a red box, but the black is very classy. It looks really, really good.
But of course, if you open the doors, it's red in the back.
Oh. Well, I can't come in here, unfortunately. I don't have the box with me, but
and the version that I stole to take home isn't the real version. This is the gift pack version, because I even went for the glass to match it for this. I stole it from the office. So no, yeah, we wanted, you know, we said we wanted to have some red because it's Glenfarclas, so it needs some red, but we didn't want it to be fully red. So yeah, if you open the doors behind the bottle, the cutout is in red leather. So
yeah.
You really do get that little bit of peat there, though. It is quite noticeable on the nose, along with so many other flavors too. But compared to the rest of them, it's much more noticeable because obviously everything in this would have been peated. You do occasionally get tiny hints of peat on other Glenfarclases too, simply because if it's a second fill cask, but the first fill was from when they peated it, it can still influence it a little bit. So other Glenfarclas bottlings do sometimes have that little bit of peat there too, but it's nowhere near as obvious as it is on this, because obviously all of the casks would have had that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. I think I can see more of that on the finish. It's still a very, like, it's not a big peat, but there's definitely an earthiness there. And
Yeah,
I guess where it's confusing is it's hard to know where those like earthy dunnage, like sherry notes meet that peat and how to completely distinguish the two of them. But yeah, it's a different style. I love it. This is a very, very old school style of whiskey. I'm lucky. This is my third time getting to try this. I obviously had it when I was over with you in Scotland. We did the tasting in store last month, and then to try it again. I mean, this is a real treat. Because this is, even for Glenfarclas, this is an incredibly old, rare, and special dram.
I think even for me too. I mean, I think this is my fifth time drinking it only. So when we did the tasting notes, it was Callum and I sat down with, again, one of these little official minis, and we did the tasting notes together. And then I did one other event with it in Switzerland. So Switzerland did an event with it back in March, where we sat at the chef's table in a really, really nice hotel in Lucerne and drank a bottle of it after having had a really, really nice meal. And then, of course, with you, what was that? Is it 3 weeks ago today or 4 weeks ago today? I've lost track of the weeks.
I think it was about 3 weeks ago today. Sounds right.
And then, to be sitting in my own living room at 1:15 in the morning drinking it is quite fun too.
Absolutely.
I will not be not finishing this. That's for sure. So yeah. I just have to walk upstairs to bed.
Well, same here. I think all of us are in the same boat on that, although it's a lot earlier where
I was going to say, you guys all have your evening meals to have. And
well, it depends. I mean, there are some people out in, I think the furthest east we've got tonight is Ontario and Quebec. So Ontario and Quebec, it's getting close to, well, it's a little after 8 there now. But then there's also the handful of guys out in BC where it's only just after 5. So there you go.
It's still daylight there.
Absolutely. Well, I like to go back through the whiskeys one more time. I don't know if you've got your, like, but I'd like to see how they change. We do our little, I call it a speed round, and then we're going to do a poll. But I just want to say about that 50, like especially when we sat down and had that in the store, the wheels in my head were already turning to, like, all right, I'm turning 50 in 5 years. Do I on paper have the business tuck one of these bottles aside to get opened in 5 years' time? So trying to figure something out like that.
For research purposes.
Absolutely. Or there'll be an event. There'll be an event, of course.
Or it gets dropped.
Yeah.
Dropped.
Oops. Yeah.
Oops. How did that happen?
Well, going back to the 15, I mean, it's still very pleasant, still lovely, but it's a different, it's playing on a different field. It's a different league. It's in the minor leagues compared to some of these other ones. And not that it's not good, it's just it's a tough crowd. It's a tough crowd. But surprising to me is how prominent the barley is. And I didn't really get it as much when we were tasting it, but those barley tones on both the nose and the palate, and it makes sense, it's only 15, are quite prominent.
It's not noticeable the first time around because there's so much else going on with it too. But as you say, comparing it to what we've had since, it just seems quite light almost, which is weird because people usually describe the 15 as being quite a heavy one.
It is. I mean, but it does also show, and I think you see this throughout the whole range, like Glenfarclas has like a thicker, oily kind of body to it, and all of them have that element. And
that's the direct firing, we believe, anyway, and the size of the stills too. I mean, they are physically big, so we're talking 26,500 liters for the wash stills. So it is, and the size just means it has more space and time to kind of build that body. But they say that when they tried to go away from direct firing, it lost that body, and that was why they said, no, we're not changing in that case. We're leaving it as it is.
But there was a period, well, when you just had to stop shoveling coal because that's just not very efficient. So
no, and also very hard to be consistent in terms of temperature, very
Mhm.
dirty. I mean, basically very dirty.
Yeah.
And of course, it was also around the time that a certain Mrs. Thatcher got involved with coal mines, so maybe that had something to do with it too.
Could be. Who knows? Back to the 21. It's almost like potpourri now. It's so floral compared to some of the others.
I'm getting quite fudgy as well.
Fudgy. I'm still getting that kind of pie crust, but maybe now it's more of a savory pie than the blueberry pie. Like a chicken tortilla or something like that, or a chicken pot pie with some nice herbs in it. Still lovely. The 25. Yeah, it's funny how much all of these have changed over the course of the tasting. And it's all just one distillery. The palate's held up really well, though. Still more rich, spicier, more chocolate, candied
Yeah,
fruit.
there's definitely a chocolate. I think it's chocolate. I'm really feeling there
Mhm.
now. Or maybe because I'm about to crack open my Lindor to go with it.
Well, then you might never get to sleep. That's the
The
uh,
whiskey will help.
but it's the weekend.
It is the weekend. All I'm doing tomorrow is playing Christmas carols. So
30, very elegant, very soft. Um, there are some nice chocolate tones in there too, some nice fruit. Um,
oh, really
actually,
fruity.
yeah, surprisingly going very tropical now, that especially on the palate, that I didn't pick up before. My nose, I had COVID earlier in the week, so my nose is not where it normally is. And I actually found this, I had a couple of tastings last night, and I found that the second time round I went through the whiskeys, my nose was dulling earlier than it would normally. So I'm not getting as much on the nose right now, but the palate on that was still just awesome. And the 35 seems to be going into more like vanilla tones. It's spicier than the 30 to me on the nose.
Oh, a little bit minty almost as well.
Mm, yeah. Soft, very fruity. In fact, actually the fruit on that is really amped up since it's been sitting in the glass the last little while, at least on my palate here. And on to the big boys, the 40 and the 50. Oh, the nose on that 40 though is still, it's just classic, old school, elegant. I mean, I think every
Rich.
distillery needs to dream of one day having something like this. Like that should be every distillery's goal, would be to dream of having a whiskey this good.
I used to say I would drink whiskey older than me. Well, at least still work at distillery for that's even possible. It just gets really, 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 really expensive.
Yeah, I've had a similar challenge over the years. I've definitely been spoiled, and certainly it was hard for the longest time to get me interested in a whiskey older than me. But now I'm older than a 40-year-old Glenfarclas, so the tables have turned a little bit there. Um, Back to the 50. I've only got a little bit left of that in here, but man, this is still such a gorgeous bottling. Um, yeah.
It would be
Oh,
classed as sacrilege that I should put a little bit of water in mine, but you know, it's always from having done the tasting notes, I know that it actually does change it a lot, which of course is also normal for its age. But
we call that
yeah,
science. So
absolutely,
yeah,
it's close to
I'm
science as I'm ever going to get.
water is such, we haven't really touched on it tonight. And I mean, partly I'm always very cautious recommending water, especially for older whiskeys like these, because I find from my personal experience, they tend to be more fragile
And
and
yeah,
don't
the
fit as
cuts
well.
lose the palate. Yeah,
And sherry as well. I find sherry cask whiskeys for some reason don't take water as well as bourbon cask whiskeys do. But um, none of these to me, like I just, for my palate, I don't think I could add water to them, because I love them the way they are.
it
Um,
is. It's a funny one. I mean, for me personally, it goes back as well to the fact that as an 18-year-old saying I'll never drink whiskey, it's horrible, to becoming a 20-year-old who went, maybe whiskey's not quite so bad. I did start drinking whiskey a lot younger than most people, but that was because I was working in a distillery, and that's how I was taught, you know.
Mhm.
So when the master blender tells
Mhm.
you this is how you do it, then it's just something that you always will try. But very much at the case at this age, you definitely have to drink at least half of it before, just to see the difference it makes.
Mhm. Uh, I'm going to trigger the poll here. So everyone gets a chance to vote. If I can get this thing to work, for their two favorite whiskeys, and
It's so
hopefully,
high tech. I'm so impressed.
yeah, we'll see if this works. Normally, Evan has the polls done for me, and he didn't tonight. So hopefully, I got this right. It looks like it's right, but you get first favorite and second favorite um, to vote. Deb, you don't, unfortunately, because you're a co-host, you don't get to vote, but I could change that if you wanted to vote. But normally what we do for the hosts is we wait until the numbers roll in, and then we declare what our favorites are. And
Nice.
I don't know if that's too political for you because you like them all equally.
No, we're absolutely never that bothered about these things, you know. Um, we very much believe that everyone has their own palate, and you know, it was quite funny. A friend who works in our distillery, I sat in one of his tastings too. I think I've said this to you before. You know, one of the things that I love the most about this industry is just how um, collaborative it is, and the fact that you know I will go to people's tastings and enjoy them as much as you know as much as anything else. And um, one of my friends in the industry did a tasting, and he was asked what's the best whiskey, and he said there isn't one, because if there was, it's the only one we'd make.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, my regret is in the 23 years since I started doing this, I don't know how many times I've actually taken part in a whiskey tasting, but it's going to be thousands, probably similar to yourself, Andrew.
Mhm.
And I've never ever done a tasting with more than two people where everyone agreed at the end what was the best.
Yeah. No, and that
Um,
the world would be a boring place if that was the case. And um, you know, you can use a lot of the old tropes that are out there. Like people will say, whatever I'm drinking right now is my favorite whiskey or the best whiskey. But I mean, there's some
especially
that,
as a 50-year-old.
yeah, there's some that are better than others. And then not all playing fields are the same. And so it's hard to put everything in the same league as one other, which is one of the reasons why I honestly, I don't mind people who review and score whiskeys. What I don't like are individuals or groups that declare whiskey of the year, because I think sometimes there's motives that are not always
Declared.
clear. And some of those things to me are just, it becomes a bit off-putting because it's just a way to dupe people and get people excited about something, and or make headlines. Like we don't need to mention him, but there's a guy out there who picks whiskey
Ugh.
beer just
Sorry,
to
did
make
I just make that obvious?
he's also a very unsavory individual who we choose not to name specifically.
The
Um,
shudder might have given it away, though.
the shutter probably did. Or like if you had a glow in your eye, like a sulfurous glow, that would have done it too. Anyway, yeah, like declaring those things, it's always fun to know what people like and to have a sense of what's good, but to suggest that something's a lot of times better than something else is
Yeah.
tough because it's your taste. Your taste is different. Anyway, Deb, I think we've almost got everyone voted here. There's two people who haven't. So before we show the results, just out of curiosity, if you had to pick, and I know they only got two, but you're going to get three favorites. What, in order, are your three favorite whiskeys from the lineup tonight?
Me.
Yes.
Well, obviously the 50, because how often do you get to drink whiskey like this?
And have it be
Um,
good.
and then probably would have to say the 40 as well. For me as well, it's also a question of rarity and how often I get to drink these. And even for me, it's not that common to get to have certainly not all of these in one go. But then for number three, I'd have to say 21. And I shouldn't say that since it's not currently available, but this is how honest I'm being. I would say the 21. You go back through them again.
So Deb, this is super awkward. I have the exact same three favorites. The 50 is in a league of its own. It's there's no competition on that. The 40 is still excellent and like head and shoulders above everything else. But as much as I like the 30 and I like the 35, I still really love that buttery blueberry pie, creamy Glenfarclas 21. And I've been lucky. I know Alan, actually, I think he had my 25 up there, but I've been able to do 2 cast strength 21s over time, which I'm incredibly grateful to have done. And it is, yeah, I've long said 40 aside, the 21 was always my favorite whiskey in the range, and it still is. 40 and 50 aside, it's still my favorite whiskey.
Now, one word to add to that now. So when are we going to add the one above that?
Yeah. Well, you know what? I don't know that I've ever had the 60 before. So
The 60 is long gone, but the 70 is coming.
well, we'll look forward to doing a tasting with the 70 at some point in the future. So I've just ended the poll. I'm going to share the results here, and they're not entirely surprising to me. First favorite is the Glenfarclas 50. Almost everybody picked it, but you know what? There was a couple who said 30 and a couple who said 40. So you got to love that. And then second favorite, the 40, storming through with the second favorite. And everything from 25 and up got votes from people here for first and second favorites. So I think those are pretty good results. People like things throughout the range, which is, not a surprise because I think everything there's got some merit. So that's our lineup tonight. Deb, I don't know if there's anything you want to add or if anyone's got any quick questions they want to ask before we wrap this up, but anything we should be looking forward to from Glenfarclas?
Well, I did send this information to Michelle earlier about a certain special edition that's coming, and I would be shocked if you don't get some of the allocation of it.
I'm sure I'll be well looked after. I always am. So
Yeah.
there's no doubts on that. But nothing you can tease us with yet. It's not out there.
It's not out there. It's not out there yet. Literally, the first bottle came to distillery yesterday. So this is something which is very, very new. So I'm not going to say too much other than it might be in the 105 family.
Okay. Special edition 105 is what I'm hearing, which is very exciting. I like it.
Always good fun. And then, of course, you have one, which is also exciting.
It's true. And we've embargoed the label on that, which normally we don't. But I know Alan was commenting in the chat earlier about he loves our cast strength bottlings. We do have a cast strength bottling coming from Glenfarclas. It does not have my face on it. That run, which was a long run, longer than most expected, is probably done. But there's a special edition Glenfarclas coming that'll be released on February 11th, which is a very specific date, because some of you might recall that's the date that we had a rather rude awakening early in the morning when a gentleman drove a stolen pickup truck through our front entrance. So let's just say there's a special bottling coming to commemorate said incident, and we won't be sharing the artwork on that until we release the whiskey on that date. So that's coming up, and something to look forward to. Yes, it may have involved a Dodge Ram. What's that? It's great. We
tried it.
We couldn't do it for this tasting because we had to get the kits poured in time for people to get them out of province. But the people in Calgary got to try it. They got to see the label, but they didn't get to take a photo of it.
I can't believe you told them that. You just made them jealous now.
It's embargoed. And I'd show them to you, but this is live on Facebook and it'll eventually be on YouTube, and then it'll be out there in the world. And we're trying to, there's so few secrets anymore. We want to keep this a surprise until the day of. So, but I'm really happy with it. I'm very grateful to Glenfarclas for making it an opportunity for us. Deb, I want to thank you again for being able to do this tasting for us, to doing it frankly twice, once in store and once virtually with us. So thank you very much. Thanks for staying up late tonight.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
It's
Go ahead.
So I don't think I'll have any problem going to sleep though after this as well.
It's a healthy sample. I think you're going to do fine. I want to thank Bernadette, Michelle, everyone from Pacific Wine and Spirits, as always, for their support. I want to thank all of you who were willing to purchase a set of samples for this tasting. I know it wasn't an expensive tasting, but it wouldn't have happened without all of you. So thank you very much for that. And if we don't speak to you before, happy Hanukkah to those of you who are celebrating Hanukkah. Merry Christmas to those of you celebrating Christmas. Happy New Year, happy Hogmanay, all that stuff. Deb, thank you very much for your time. And everybody, I hope you have a great night. We'll talk again soon.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.